going to tell you something that happened to me 3 years ago, and I need you to understand that every word of this is true. I've never told this story to anyone except my therapist, and even she looks at me like I'm crazy when I get to certain parts. But I don't care anymore who believes me. I need to get this out. You've probably heard stories about Bigfoot sightings, blurry photos, weird sounds in the woods. Maybe you believe them, maybe you don't. I used to be a skeptic myself. Used to laugh at those grainy videos on the internet, roll my eyes at the people on TV talking about their encounters. That was before I learned the truth, before I lost my best friend to one of those things. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me and my buddy heading up to his family's cabin in the Cascade Mountains for some fishing, drinking, and getting away from the city. We'd been planning this trip for months, both of us working too many hours at our desk jobs, stressed out and needing a break. The cabin was about 4 hours north, tucked away in the deep woods where cell service was spotty and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Perfect for what we needed. We left on a Friday evening after work, stopped at a liquor store to grab some beer and whiskey, threw our gear in the back of my pickup truck, and hit the road. The plan was to drive through the night and get to the cabin early Saturday morning so we could have the whole weekend. My friend had already started celebrating before we even left town. He'd had a few drinks while we were packing, and by the time we were an hour into the drive, he was in that perfect mood where everything was funny and the world seemed right. The drive started out normal enough. We had the windows down, classic rock playing on the radio, talking about work and girls and our plans for the weekend. The highway wound through farmland at first, then gradually climbed into foothills as we got closer to the mountains. Traffic thinned out as the night went on, and by the time we hit the mountain roads, we were mostly alone out there. That's when my friend started getting really loose. He was singing along to every song on the radio, telling jokes that weren't even funny, but making me laugh anyway because of how he was telling them. We were both in great spirits, just two guys in their 20s having the kind of carefree fun that gets harder to come by as you get older. The mountain road was narrow and winding, the kind where you have to take your time even in daylight. At night, with just my headlights cutting through the darkness, it was slow going. Dense forest pressed in on both sides, tall pines and firs creating walls of black that seemed to swallow up everything beyond the reach of my lights. Every now and then, we'd catch a glimpse of eyes reflecting back at us from the tree line, deer or elk watching us pass. About 2 hours into the mountain driving, this old country song came on the radio that we both knew from childhood. I can't even remember what it was now, but at the time it felt like the most important song in the world. We both started singing along, really belting it out, my friend playing air guitar in the passenger seat. We were laughing and carrying on, completely caught up in the moment. That's when it happened. My friend suddenly stopped singing mid-verse and grabbed my arm. His voice cut through the music, sharp and urgent. He shouted something about watching out, but before I could even process what he was saying, I saw it. There, directly in front of my truck, maybe 50 feet ahead in the middle of the road, was something massive. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe a bear that had wandered onto the asphalt, or a moose. But even in that split second before impact, I knew it was neither. This thing was standing upright on two legs, easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown fur that caught my headlights like a wild animal's coat. Its arms hung at its sides, longer than human arms, and its head was massive, with a distinctive cone shape that no bear or person would have. The whole encounter lasted maybe 2 seconds from the time I saw it until impact, but it felt like slow motion. I remember yanking the steering wheel hard to the right, trying to swerve around it. But the creature just stood there. It didn't run or try to get out of the way. It just looked directly at us with these dark, intelligent eyes that reflected my headlights. There was something almost calm about its expression, like it had been expecting us. Then we hit it. The impact was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. You hear about car crashes and think you know what to expect, but nothing prepares you for the violence of it. The front end of my truck crumpled instantly. The windshield exploded inward in a shower of safety glass. The creature's massive body came right through where the windshield used to be, filling the cab of the truck for one terrifying moment before everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Could have been minutes, could have been an hour. When I started to come around, I was drifting in and out of awareness, my head pounding and something warm trickling down my face that I realized was blood. The truck had come to rest at an angle, the front end wrapped around a tree about 20 feet off the road. In those fuzzy moments between consciousness and unconsciousness, I became aware of sounds. Heavy breathing that wasn't human. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from deep in a massive chest. And then movement, something large shifting around near the wreckage of my truck. I forced my eyes open just a crack and saw it. The creature was pulling itself up from the ground where it had been thrown by the impact. It moved slowly, like it was hurt, but it was definitely alive and moving under its own power. This thing that should have been killed by a direct hit from a pickup truck going 40 miles an hour was getting back on its feet. The growl came again, deeper this time, and I could feel it vibrating in my chest. It was the sound a predator makes when it's angry, when something has hurt it, and it's deciding what to do about it. Through my barely open eyes, I watched the creature look around, taking stock of the situation. Its head turned toward the truck, toward where my friend and I were trapped in the cab, and I saw those dark eyes focus on us with unmistakable intelligence. Then everything went black again. The next thing I remember is fragments, being dragged across a rough ground, my body bumping over rocks and roots, the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves, tree branches scraping against my arms and face as I was pulled deeper into the forest. In my semi-conscious state, I could hear another body being dragged alongside me, but I couldn't turn my head to look. Looking back now, I can piece together what must have happened. This creature, this Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it, had survived our crash. Maybe it was hurt, maybe it was angry, but it was definitely alive and powerful enough to grab both of us and haul us off into the woods. Why it did that instead of just leaving us there or finishing us off, I'll never understand. Maybe it was curious about us. Maybe it had plans for us. All I know is that we were completely at its mercy. When I finally came to fully, I was lying on my back in the middle of the forest. The canopy above me was so thick that almost no starlight filtered through, leaving me in nearly complete darkness. My whole body ached from the crash, and I could feel that something was wrong with my ribs on the left side. Breathing was painful and shallow, my head was still bleeding, and my vision was blurry. I lay there for a few minutes trying to get my bearings. The air was cold and damp, filled with the sounds of the deep woods, wind through the trees, small animals moving in the underbrush, the distant call of an owl. But no human sounds, no cars on a nearby road, no voices calling for help. Just the vast, indifferent silence of the wilderness. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I became aware of a shape nearby. Something large and motionless against the base of a tree. My heart jumped as I realized it was my friend. I forced myself to sit up, ignoring the sharp pain in my ribs, and crawled over to where he lay. He was on his side, facing away from me, completely still. I called his name softly, then louder when he didn't respond. Nothing. With shaking hands, I reached out and touched his shoulder, turning him toward me. His head lolled back limply, and even in the darkness, I could see that something was very wrong. His eyes were open, but unseeing, staring at nothing. I pressed my ear to his chest, listening for a heartbeat, feeling for breath against my cheek. Nothing. panic flooded through me as the reality of the situation hit. I pressed my fingers against his neck, searching desperately for a pulse, but his skin was already growing cold. My best friend, the guy I'd known since high school, who'd been laughing and singing with me just hours earlier, was dead. Without thinking, I started CPR. I'd taken a class years earlier for work, and the muscle memory kicked in automatically. Tilt the head back, check the airway, place hands on the chest, push hard and fast. I counted out loud as I worked, pressing down on his chest with all the strength I could muster, stopping every 30 compressions to breathe into his lungs. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3. I kept going, sweating despite the cold air, my broken ribs screaming in protest with every compression. I told myself he would come back, that I could bring him back if I just kept trying. But deep down, I knew it was too late. His body was too cold, too still. Whatever had killed him had happened too long ago. After 5 minutes of CPR, I had to stop. I was exhausted, my ribs felt like they were on fire, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely maintain a rhythm. I sat back on my heels, looking down at my friend's lifeless face, and felt tears starting to run down my cheeks. That's when I heard the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps crashing through the underbrush, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. Each footfall was like a tree falling, accompanied by the sound of branches breaking and small trees being pushed aside. Whatever was making those sounds was massive and moving with purpose. The growling started again, that same deep, rumbling sound I'd heard after the crash. But now there were multiple voices joining in, a chorus of inhuman sounds echoing through the trees. These things were communicating with each other, and they were getting closer. I looked around frantically for somewhere to hide. About 10 feet away was a thick patch of brush and fallen logs that might provide some cover. Moving as quietly as I could, I crawled over and squeezed myself into the tangle of branches and dead wood. Thorns tore at my clothes and skin, but I barely noticed. All that mattered was making myself invisible, just in time. The footsteps were getting louder, and now I could see a huge shape moving between the trees, silhouetted against the slightly lighter sky. It was the creature from the road, or one just like it. In the darkness, it looked even more massive and threatening than it had in my headlights. Its shoulders were easily 4 feet wide, and its arms hung down past its knees. It moved with a fluid, predatory grace that was terrifying to watch. The creature approached the spot where my friend lay and stopped. For a long moment, it just stood there, looking down at the body. Then it reached down with one enormous hand and grabbed my friend by the ankle. Without any apparent effort, it began dragging him away into the darkness. I pressed my face into the dirt and leaves, biting my lip to keep from making any sound as tears streamed down my face. I was watching my best friend being taken away by a monster, and there was absolutely nothing I could do about it. If I tried to intervene, I'd just end up dead too. So I lay there like a coward and let it happen. The sounds of the creature moving through the forest gradually faded as it carried my friend deeper into the wilderness. But just when I thought it was over, the night exploded with the most terrifying sound I've ever heard. It started as a scream, but not like any human scream. This was something primal and wild, a roar that seemed to come from the very soul of the wilderness itself. It was joined by another voice, then another, until the entire forest was filled with a cacophony of inhuman cries that made my bones vibrate. These were the voices of the Sasquatch calling to each other across the darkness. The screaming went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise had been. I knew now that I wasn't dealing with just one creature. There was a whole group of them out there, and they knew I was in their territory. I couldn't stay hidden in the brush forever, My ribs were getting worse, making it harder and harder to breathe. My head was still bleeding, and I was starting to feel dizzy and nauseous. If I didn't get medical attention soon, I was going to die out here just like my friend. But more than that, every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible before those things came back. The rational part of my mind knew I was in no condition to go hiking through the wilderness, especially in the dark. But the animal part of my brain didn't care about rational, it just wanted me to move. So I started crawling out of my hiding spot, trying to be as quiet as possible. Every movement sent waves of pain through my chest, and I had to stop several times to rest and fight off the nausea. But eventually I made it out of the brush and onto my feet. I had no idea which direction to go. In the darkness, surrounded by trees, I couldn't tell which way we'd come from or where the road might be. All I could do was pick a direction that seemed to lead downhill and start walking, hoping I'd eventually find my way back to civilization. The first hour was the hardest. I stumbled through the forest like a drunk man, tripping over roots and walking into trees. My vision kept going in and out of focus, and several times I had to stop and lean against a tree to keep from falling over. The pain in my ribs was getting worse with every step, and I was starting to suspect that one of them had punctured my lung. But somehow I kept moving, one foot in front of the other, pushing through the pain and exhaustion driven by the terror of what might be following me. Every shadow looked like a monster. Every sound made me freeze and listen for those heavy footsteps. I was completely alone in a hostile wilderness, injured and lost, and I knew that if those creatures found me again, I wouldn't be as lucky as I'd been the first time. About 2 hours into my trek, I started feeling like I was going to pass out. The dizziness was getting worse, and my legs felt like they were made of rubber. I was leaning heavily against a tree, trying to catch my breath, when I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps somewhere behind me in the darkness. I looked back the way I'd come, straining my eyes to see anything in the black forest. For a moment there was nothing, just the usual sound of wind and small animals. Then I saw it, a massive shape moving between the trees, following my trail. Panic gave me strength I didn't know I still had. I pushed off from the tree and started moving as fast as I could, crashing through the underbrush without any attempt at stealth. Behind me, the footsteps got faster too, and I could hear branches breaking as the creature picked up its pace. I ran like that for maybe 10 minutes, my lungs burning and my ribs screaming in protest, until I literally couldn't take another step. I collapsed behind a fallen log, gasping for air and fighting off another wave of nausea. The footsteps had stopped, but I knew the creature was still out there somewhere, watching and waiting. That's when I started to lose consciousness again. The pain and exhaustion were too much, and despite the danger, my body was shutting down. The world started to go gray around the edges, and I felt myself slumping forward. But just as I was about to pass out completely, I heard a voice. It was my friend calling my name, clear as day, like he was standing right next to me. I forced my eyes open and looked around, expecting to see nothing, but there he was, standing about 10 feet away, looking completely normal and healthy, like nothing had happened to him at all. He was smiling that same easy smile he'd had in the truck, and he looked peaceful, happy even. He held up one hand and gestured for me to follow him, then turned and started walking deeper into the forest. I knew it couldn't be real. I'd felt his cold skin, seen his lifeless eyes. I'd watched that creature drag his body away into the darkness. But there he was, as real as anything, waiting for me to catch up. Maybe it was the head injury, maybe it was shock or blood loss, or just my mind trying to protect itself from the trauma of what had happened. But in that moment, I didn't care. My friend was there, and he was going to help me get out of this nightmare. I struggled to my feet and followed him. He moved just fast enough that I could keep up, stopping whenever I needed to rest, always staying just at the edge of my vision. Behind us, I could still hear the sounds of pursuit, heavy footsteps, branches breaking, that low growling that made my skin crawl. But my friend led me around obstacles, through clearings, always keeping us one step ahead of whatever was hunting me. The first thing he told me to do seemed crazy, but I was beyond questioning anything at that point. He led me to a small, muddy creek bed where the spring runoff had created a thick, dark puddle of organic muck. Without saying a word, he pointed to the mud and then to me, making covering motions with his hands. I understood immediately. My scent. The creatures were tracking me by smell, and the mud would mask my human odor. I knelt down in the cold muck and started smearing it all over my exposed skin, my face, neck, hands, anywhere the creatures might pick up my scent. The mud was ice cold and smelled like rotting vegetation, but I coated myself thoroughly. My friend nodded approvingly and pointed upstream. We followed the creek for about half a mile, my feet numb from the freezing water, but it seemed to work. The sounds of pursuit grew more distant and confused. I could hear the creatures calling to each other, their vocalizations taking on a frustrated tone like they'd lost the trail. But my relief was short-lived. As we climbed up the far bank of the creek, my friend suddenly grabbed my arm and pulled me down behind a massive fallen tree. He pressed a finger to his lips and pointed through the rotting logs. Not 20 feet away, one of the creatures was standing perfectly still in a small clearing. This was the closest I'd been to one of them since the crash, and the sight made my throat close up with terror. It was even larger than I'd realized, easily 9 feet tall with shoulders that seemed impossibly broad. Its entire body was covered in dark, matted hair that looked coarse and thick. But what struck me most was how human-like its posture was. It wasn't hunched over like a gorilla or walking on its knuckles. It stood completely upright with an intelligence in its movements that was unmistakably aware. The creature was testing the air, its massive head turning slowly from side to side as it searched for my scent. Its face was a nightmare blend of human and ape features. Prominent brow ridge, deep-set eyes that reflected what little light filtered through the canopy, and a mouthful of teeth that were far too large and sharp for any herbivore. For 10 agonizing minutes, we lay frozen behind that log while the creature methodically searched the area. It would take a few steps in one direction, stop and listen, then move to another spot and repeat the process. Several times it came so close I could hear its breathing. Deep, measured breaths that sounded disturbingly human. Finally, it let out a low grunt and moved off in the wrong direction, away from where we were hiding. My friend waited another 5 minutes before signaling that it was safe to move. As we continued deeper into the forest, my friend started giving me more survival instructions through gestures and whispered words. He showed me how to step on rocks instead of soft ground to avoid leaving tracks. He pointed out which branches would make noise if I brushed against them and which paths would keep us hidden from view. At one point, he led me to a thick patch of wild blackberry bushes. The thorns tore at my already damaged clothes, but he insisted I crawl through them. On the other side, I understood why. My torn clothing had caught dozens of thorns and leaves, natural camouflage that would help break up my human silhouette. The berry juice also added another layer of scent masking. The pain in my ribs was getting worse with every passing hour. Breathing was becoming more and more difficult, and I was starting to cough up small amounts of blood. But my friend kept encouraging me to push forward, always staying just close enough that I could see him, but far enough ahead that I had to keep moving to follow. We were about 3 hours into our escape when the real terror began. I heard them before I saw them, a coordinated hunting call that seemed to come from all directions at once. These creatures weren't just randomly searching anymore. They'd organized themselves into a proper hunting party, and they were closing in on our location with military precision. My friend's demeanor changed instantly. Where before he'd been calm and methodical, now there was urgency in his movements. He grabbed my hand and pulled me toward a steep, rocky outcropping that rose about 50 feet above the forest floor. The climb was agony with my broken ribs, but he wouldn't let me stop. Halfway up the rock face, he guided me into a narrow crevice, barely wide enough for a person to fit through. It was a natural cave formation, invisible from below and accessible only if you knew exactly where to look. We squeezed through the opening and found ourselves in a small chamber about the size of a closet, just in time. Within minutes, I could hear the hunting party passing directly below us. There had to be at least 6 of them, maybe more. Their communication was unlike anything I'd ever heard, a complex series of grunts, clicks, and low-frequency rumbles that seemed to carry detailed information. They were talking to each other, coordinating their search pattern like a military unit. One of them stopped directly below our hiding spot. Through a crack in the rock, I could see the top of its head as it examined the base of the cliff. For a terrifying moment, I thought it might try to climb up and find us, but another creature called from across the clearing and it moved on. We stayed in that cave for what felt like hours. My friend sat across from me in the tiny space, and for the first time since I'd started seeing him, he spoke in full sentences. He told me that the creatures had a territory that extended for miles in every direction, and that they knew every inch of it. They had established hunting patterns and communication networks that allowed them to coordinate over vast distances. Most importantly, he said, they were intelligent enough to hold grudges. We had invaded their territory and injured one of their own. They wouldn't stop hunting until they found me. He explained that the mud and berry juice would only hide my scent for so long. Eventually, they would find us through sheer persistence if we couldn't get out of their territory completely. The key was to keep moving toward the edge of their range while avoiding the main trails they used for patrolling. As he talked, I found myself studying his face in the dim light filtering through the cave opening. He looked exactly the same as he always had. Same smile, same expressions, same way of running his hand through his hair when he was thinking. But there was something different about his eyes. They had a depth to them that hadn't been there before, like he was seeing things from a perspective I couldn't understand. When the sounds of the hunting party finally faded, my friend led me out of the cave and down the other side of the rocky outcropping. We were now in a different part of the forest, where the trees grew more densely and the undergrowth was thicker. The canopy was so heavy here that almost no light reached the ground, creating a perpetual twilight that was disorienting and claustrophobic. My friend seemed to know exactly where he was going, leading me along what looked like animal trails that wound between the massive tree trunks. Every so often, he would stop and have me rub against certain trees, ones with particularly strong scents from sap or moss that would help mask any remaining trace of my human smell. The next close encounter came when we were crossing a small meadow where a lightning strike had brought down several large trees years earlier. The fallen giants created a maze of obstacles that we had to navigate carefully. My friend was leading me around a particularly large trunk when he suddenly froze and motioned for me to get down. On the far side of the clearing, 3 of the creatures were having what could only be described as a conference. They stood in a rough triangle facing each other, and their vocalizations had taken on a different quality. More organized, like they were sharing information and making plans. From our hiding spot behind the fallen tree, I could observe them more closely than I had before. These weren't just large, dumb animals. Their posture, their gestures, the way they seemed to be taking turns communicating, it all pointed to a level of intelligence that was deeply unsettling. One of them, the largest of the 3, seemed to be giving instructions to the others. It would make a series of sounds while pointing in different directions, and the other two would respond with what sounded like acknowledgement. Then they would all turn and look in a new direction while the leader repeated the process. They were dividing up search sectors. After about 10 minutes of this coordination, the three creatures split up and headed off in different directions. One of them came uncomfortably close to our hiding spot, close enough that I could see the individual hairs on its massive arms and catch the musky, wild smell that seemed to follow them everywhere. When it was finally safe to move, my friend led me in the direction that none of the creatures had taken. But as we made our way through the deadfall, I noticed something that made my stomach clench with fear. Fresh tracks in the soft earth around the fallen trees. Not just from the three creatures we'd just seen, but from many others. This clearing was some kind of regular meeting point for them. My friend must have seen my expression because he pointed to the tracks and then made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the entire forest around us. His meaning was clear. We were deep in their territory now, in the heart of their domain. Every step we took was bringing us closer to more of them. The next few hours were a nightmare of constant tension. We would move for 20 or 30 minutes at a time, then have to hide as another search party passed nearby. The creatures seemed to be everywhere, their calls echoing through the forest from all directions. Some of the sounds were clearly communication, but others were different. Triumphant roars that made me wonder if they had found some other unfortunate soul who had wandered into their territory. My friend's guidance became more specific and urgent as the night wore on. He showed me how to walk on the edges of my feet to minimize sound. He taught me to breathe through my nose only, explaining through gestures that my mouth breathing was too loud and too distinctly human. When we came to streams or muddy areas, he insisted I wade through them to further confuse my trail. At one point, we came across what looked like territorial markers. Trees that had been stripped of bark in deliberate patterns, piles of stones arranged in specific configurations, even what looked like crude symbols scratched into rock faces. My friend hurried me past these areas quickly, making it clear that lingering near them would be extremely dangerous. The most terrifying encounter came around what I estimated to be 3 a.m. We were making our way down a steep hillside when my friend suddenly pushed me flat against the ground behind a cluster of boulders. The urgency of his movement told me this was different from the other times we'd hidden. From somewhere above us on the hill came a sound I'll never forget. A long, mournful call that started low and built to an almost musical crescendo before trailing off into silence. It was answered immediately by similar calls from at least 4 different directions, creating a haunting chorus that echoed off the hills. But this wasn't a hunting call or a communication signal. This was something else entirely, something ceremonial. The calls continued for nearly an hour, becoming more complex and layered as more voices joined in. At times it almost sounded like singing, if singing could be done by creatures with vocal cords designed for roaring. My friend kept me pressed against the ground the entire time, his hand on my back in a gesture that was both protective and warning. Whatever was happening up on that hillside, we definitely didn't want to be discovered during it. When the calls finally stopped, the silence that followed was absolute. Even the normal forest sounds, insects, small animals, wind through the trees, had gone completely quiet. It was as if the entire wilderness was holding its breath. My friend waited a full 30 minutes before he allowed us to move again. When we finally did, he led me in a wide arc around the hillside, keeping us far away from whatever had been taking place up there. But as we skirted the area, I caught glimpses of movement in the darkness above us, large shapes moving with purpose among the trees. The pain in my chest was becoming unbearable by this point. Each breath felt like someone was stabbing me with a knife, and the taste of blood in my mouth was getting stronger. I was starting to have episodes where my vision would go dark around the edges and I'd have to stop and lean against a tree to keep from passing out. But my friend wouldn't let me rest for long. He seemed to understand that time was running out, that if we didn't reach safety soon, I was going to collapse and never get back up. His encouragement became more intense, more urgent. He would appear right in front of me whenever I started to stumble, his presence somehow giving me the strength to take another step. We climbed up a series of increasingly steep ridges, my friend somehow finding paths that were manageable despite my condition. The higher we climbed, the thinner the trees became, and gradually I started to see more sky through the canopy. We were getting close to the edge of the deep forest. The pain in my ribs was getting worse, and I was having trouble staying conscious. I kept stumbling and falling, my vision going black around the edges. But every time I thought I couldn't go another step, my friend would appear again, encouraging me to keep moving. At one point, he led me to a small stream where I was able to splash some water on my face and take a few sips. The cold water helped clear my head a little, and for a moment I could think clearly enough to wonder what was really happening to me. Was I hallucinating? Was this some kind of near-death experience? But then I heard those terrifying calls echoing through the forest again, closer than ever, and I stopped questioning and just followed. We climbed up a steep hillside, my friend somehow managing to find the easiest path through the rocks and fallen trees. By the time we reached the top, I was barely conscious, moving on pure instinct. But there, through the trees ahead, I could see something that made my heart leap. Lights, electric lights cutting through the darkness. It was a road, a real road with actual cars driving on it, not some logging trail or Forest Service track. Civilization, safety. My friend pointed toward the lights and gave me that same encouraging smile. As we got closer to the road, walking became easier. The ground was more level, and there were fewer obstacles to navigate around. My friend stayed right beside me, and for the first time since the crash, I felt like everything might be okay. When we were about 100 yards from the road, my friend did something strange. He asked if I remembered the song we'd been singing in the truck right before the crash. His voice was exactly the same as it had always been, warm and familiar. Without thinking, I started humming the melody. To my surprise, he joined in, and for a few minutes we were walking through the forest together, singing that old country song just like we had hours earlier. It felt so normal, so right, that I almost forgot about the pain in my ribs and the blood on my face. For those few minutes, it was just me and my best friend, heading home after an adventure. We reached the edge of the road just as a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. My friend pointed toward the approaching car and told me to flag it down. I stumbled out onto the asphalt, waving my arms and shouting. But the exertion was too much. The world started spinning, and I felt my legs give out underneath me. I collapsed at the edge of the road, just far enough from the trees that the car's headlights would catch me. As consciousness faded, I could hear the vehicle slowing down, doors slamming, voices shouting. People were running toward me, and I knew I was finally safe. The next thing I remember is waking up in a hospital bed. The morning sun was streaming through a window, and I could hear the familiar sounds of a busy hospital. Monitors beeping, people talking in the hallway, the squeak of wheels on linoleum floors. A nurse came in when she saw me stirring. She asked how I was feeling and checked my vitals while explaining that I'd been unconscious for almost 12 hours. I had 3 broken ribs, a concussion, and I'd lost a significant amount of blood from various cuts and scrapes. But I was alive, and I was going to be okay. When the doctor came in a little later, I asked the question that had been burning in my mind since I woke up. I asked about my friend. How was he doing? Was he in another room? Had they been able to help him? The doctor looked at me with confusion. He said there had been no one else with me when I was found. The people who had brought me to the hospital said I'd been alone at the side of the road, barely conscious and looking like I'd been through hell. I insisted that my friend had been with me. I told them about the crash, about both of us being dragged into the forest, about him helping me escape. But the doctor just exchanged glances with the nurse and gently suggested that I might be confused due to the head injury. They brought in the people who'd found me, a middle-aged couple who'd been driving home from visiting relatives. They confirmed what the doctor had said. I'd been alone on the road, no sign of anyone else. No wrecked truck nearby, no evidence of another person. I spent the next 3 days in the hospital, and every person I talked to told me the same thing. I'd been found alone. The police had searched the area but found no evidence of a crash or another victim. As far as anyone could tell, I'd simply wandered out of the forest by myself, injured and delirious. But I knew what I'd experienced. I knew my friend had been with me in that truck. I knew we'd crashed into something impossible. And I knew he'd died in those woods, taken by creatures that shouldn't exist. It took weeks for the physical injuries to heal, but the mental wounds are still there. I've been to therapists, psychiatrists, anyone who might help me make sense of what happened. Some say it was trauma-induced hallucinations. Others think the head injury caused false memories. A few have suggested that the entire experience was some kind of elaborate delusion brought on by stress and exhaustion. But I know the truth. Those things are real. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call them. They're out there in the deep woods, and they're not the gentle giants that some people make them out to be. They're predators, and my friend died because we had the bad luck to cross their path. The hardest part isn't the physical pain or even the memories of that night. It's the knowledge that my friend's body is still out there somewhere, and his family will never know what really happened to him. The police investigated his disappearance for a while, but without any evidence of foul play or a crime scene, the case eventually went cold. His parents still think I had something to do with it, and I can't bring myself to tell them the truth, because who would believe me? Who would accept that their son was killed by a creature that's supposed to be a myth? It's easier for everyone to think he just disappeared, even though I know he's never coming home. The vision of my friend helping me escape, I've thought about that a lot over the past 3 years. Was it a hallucination brought on by trauma and blood loss? Was it my subconscious mind's way of keeping me moving when my body wanted to give up? The third man factor, or however they call it. Or was it something else, something that science can't explain? I don't know, and I probably never will. All I know is that in my darkest moment, when I was lost and dying in that forest, my friend was there for me one last time. Real or imagined, he saved my life. I still have nightmares about that night. I wake up in cold sweats, hearing those inhuman screams echoing through my bedroom. Sometimes I dream that I'm still in the forest, still running from those footsteps that never seem to get closer but never go away either. And sometimes, in the worst dreams, I'm the one being dragged away into the darkness while my friend watches helplessly from the side of the road. I don't go camping anymore. I don't even like driving through wooded areas if I can help it. The thought of being back in that kind of wilderness, surrounded by trees and shadows where anything could be hiding, fills me with a panic that I can't control. People ask me sometimes why I don't try to go back to find evidence of what happened, why I don't organize search parties or contact researchers who study these creatures. The answer is simple. I never want to see one of those things again as long as I live. I survived one encounter through luck and whatever helped me get out of that forest. I don't think I'd be so fortunate a second time. But I had to tell this story even if no one believes it. Because somewhere out there, in the deep wilderness where humans rarely go, there are creatures that we don't understand. They're intelligent, they're powerful, and they're not afraid of us. And if you're ever unlucky enough to meet one face to face, I hope you have better luck than my friend and I did that night. I hope you never have to find out what it's like to lose someone you care about to something that isn't supposed to exist. And I hope you never have to experience the helplessness of knowing the truth about what happened while the rest of the world tells you it was all in your head. Because sometimes the things that aren't supposed to be real are the most dangerous of all. The official story is that my friend disappeared somewhere between our hometown and the mountains, probably the victim of a hiking accident or some other misfortune. But I know better. I know he's out there in those woods, and I know what took him. And every time I hear about someone else going missing in the wilderness, someone whose body is never found despite extensive search efforts, I wonder if they met the same fate. I wonder if there are others out there who know the truth but are too afraid to speak it, too aware that no one would believe them even if they did. The creatures are real. They're out there. And they're not the peaceful, elusive beings that cryptozoologists like to imagine. They're something else entirely, something that doesn't belong in our world but exists there anyway, in the spaces between civilization and the true wild. I've tried to move on with my life, tried to pretend that night never happened. But it's always there, lurking in the back of my mind like a shadow that never goes away. The memory of my friend's cold skin under my hands. The sound of those inhuman screams echoing through the darkness. The impossible sight of something that shouldn't exist dragging my best friend away into the night. And sometimes, in the quiet moments when I'm alone with my thoughts, I can still hear his voice calling my name through the trees. Still see him standing at the edge of my vision, waiting for me to follow him one more time. But I know now that if I follow that voice, if I go back to those woods looking for answers, I'll never come back. Because some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved, and some truths are too dangerous to pursue. My friend saved my life that night, whether it was really him or just my mind's way of keeping me alive. But he paid the ultimate price for our adventure, and I have to live with that knowledge for the rest of my life. The creatures are real. They killed my friend, and they're still out there waiting in the darkness for the next unlucky soul to wander into their territory. I just hope it's never you. For more interesting stories, check this out.